If you're doing a direct stimulation, then you have the opportunity to tweak exactly what you want. Just this center, just these neurons. Let's say you're too anxious, you want to reduce that anxiety for a while. Or you want to focus, or you want to be more awake, or you want to go to sleep, or you want to hallucinate. You could do all those things by directly stimulating. You can already try these out with transcranial electric current and that sort of process. Extraordinarily difficult for people to travel into space because our bodies are not very good at dealing with radiation. They're not very good at dealing with no oxygen. Wouldn't it be wonderful if you could just switch into another body that was great for space travel when you want to go?
Thank you, Randal. It's a pleasure and an honor to have you on Change I Am Possible, which is India's first future tech podcast. So to my audience who don't know about you, I'm going to give them like a brief introduction and then we can get into the conversation. So Mr. Randal Koene is a neuroscientist and a neuroengineer who has co-founded Carboncopies.org, where his vision is to create an outreach and road mapping organization for advancing substrate-independent minds. Randal was the director of the Department of Neuroengineering at Fatronik-Tecnalia Institute in Spain. Randal earned his PhD in computational neuroscience at the Department of Psychology at McGill University, and his Master's of Science in Electrical Engineering with a specialization in information theory at Delft University of Technology. He's a former professor at the Center of Memory and Brain of Boston University and is a co-founder of the Neuroengineering Corporation of Massachusetts. Koene established the Uploading.to website and first proposed the term and specific approach called whole brain emulation, the purpose of which is the technological accomplishment of mind transfer to a different substrate. Just reading out the bio has got my mind blown. So it's a super pleasure and honor to have you on the podcast. So let's start with, before we get into the whole brain emulation, maybe, you could describe to my audience what the brain is, the different parts of the brain, their roles and their functions.
Sure. And thank you very much for having me on, by the way. It's a great pleasure. When we talk about the brain, you could talk about many different parts. You could say it's whatever is inside your skull. So it's this gelatinous mass of neurons and synapses that process our daily visual perceptions and audio and all that. But there are of course other parts of that system that also help us process the day, and part of that actually resides outside of the skull and is in our peripheral nervous system and inside our enteric nervous system. The peripheral nervous system being the one that reaches out to all of your sensors and is mostly guided through the spine. Also works with your motor action, being able to make your body move. And then the enteric nervous system is one that is more involved with, say, keeping your body temperature regulated, the immune system, digestion, all that sort of thing, these internal homeostatic processes. So there are multiple parts of what we might call the brain. And then inside of the skull, again, you can subdivide what we're talking about into this older portion of the brain, which we sometimes sort of almost derisively call the lizard brain, but it's actually, you shouldn't be derisive about it at all because it's extraordinarily important. It's this core that's deep inside the brain, and the brain stem that does all the very basic things like making sure that our heart keeps beating and making sure that we are able to process memories at all, that we can perceive that one thing happens after another and encode that. So it's these basic older parts of the brain that do extraordinarily important things. And then outside of that, we have this part that we celebrate the most. We kind of point to it and say, this is unique about mammals, and especially the higher mammals like primates. We have this large cortex, the neocortex that's around the older brain, and we have the prefrontal cortex. It's really involved with decision making and logic and all of that sort of stuff, and personality. The cortex is famous for being this layered operational system. It's got 6 layers and it looks very similar all over, so that it reminds you a little bit of something that might have been engineered. It looks like something that you would see, if a designer came along and said, how am I going to build a system like this? They would make some unit that seemed really useful, and then they would replicate it a few million times, and that's what the cortex kind of looks like. But it's still pretty messy and unique when you get deeper down into the details there. And I don't want to overstate its purpose, because the cortex is only about 20 to 30% of the neurons in the brain. Most of our neurons are actually residing in this bottom part that's right on the bottom in the back of your head, the cerebellum, that has about 70% of your neurons. And those neurons are the ones that are involved with all that body stuff as well, right? And on top of that, we're not the animals with the most neurons at all. If you look at a blue whale, for example, a blue whale has many more neurons than we do. But it does not necessarily mean that the whale is smarter than we are, because just like I just pointed out that the 70 to 80% of the neurons are down here in this part that's just busy with body stuff, a blue whale has a very, very large body. And so just to process sensation on the skin all across that body requires a huge number of neurons, and guiding all those muscles and everything. So that's why they have a very large brain, of course.
Lovely. How fascinating. Our brain, which is the black box or the command center, it's so super awesome. You said the cerebellum consists of close to 70% of the neurons, and the neocortex has close to just 20. How cool is that? But we are now understanding what our brain is doing. I mean, in a very, very little way. I mean, roughly, I would like to describe it as something which brings about a perception, all of five senses: sight, sound, touch, smell, and taste. And that's what happens, So I'll give you one experience. So bhang is something which is like an edible version of cannabis. This is something which, we have during Holi, So yeah. I had that. I mean, this is like, 20 years back. And I swear to God, I thought that I could see 360 degrees. I could see these people with flames on their head. I could see colors all over. And that for me was like really real, but I was hallucinating. So tell me, what is going on in the brain when we are meditating, when we are dreaming, when we are maybe on a substance? What's going on?
Those are super awesome and interesting topics. I love thinking about those. Also because I've had similar experiences. So, for example, I participated in several ayahuasca ceremonies. Wow. This is, where you also try to get into a state where you're able to work on yourself in a sense by going into different conscious states. And I also enjoy meditating as a profoundly useful technique. And I think that they're quite different, actually. Meditation is very different from using a substance to help you get into a different state. Meditation, because that's, the system of the brain is still working the way it's supposed to. All the chemicals are the same as they're supposed to be. So all of the different parts of the brain that need to work together with a very specific timing, where they have to synchronize and be able to send information to one another in the way that they usually do, can still do that. And it's really your own control that is giving you a rhythm, putting you in a state that's somewhere between your normal waking and your sleeping, and the different states that you can normally achieve with the brain. And in that sense, it's very useful because you're exploring your own ability to control your mind and to control your thought. And even just things as simple as being able to push away and clear out this ongoing inner monologue, the sort of continuous loop that's going on the whole time, and sort of take a bit of perspective and try to remove yourself from it. All of that is extraordinarily valuable sometimes. So meditation, I find very useful from that point of view. But in meditation, the brain is still the brain as we normally have it. Now, if you're talking about using a substance like cannabis or something related to that, or ayahuasca or others that can be hallucinogenic, like psilocybin, the interesting thing is that what you're going to see is that sometimes, because it's blocking receptors that normally receive receptors from other neurons and that keep the timing synchronized, that this breaks down. And in typical hallucinatory experiences where you get visual hallucinations and where you see patterns, which is very strongly the case with, for example, LSD, but also ayahuasca and psilocybin, you start to see rhythmic patterns like little rectangles and diamonds and all that sort of thing. And sometimes they're extraordinarily clear. And part of the reason is because your visual system normally, it has all these receptors that are attuned to picking up on specific regular details, like they will see junctions, or they'll see lines in a certain direction, or they'll see circular objects. And what happens is that these neurons that are receptive, these receptive fields from your retina and then in your visual system further back, they combine all those layers. It's like you're taking, you know how in television you might take, red, green, and blue and then combine them to give you a color? Well, here you're combining sensors that can see certain types of thing and putting them together, and that gives you your whole image. But when you break the synchronization, all of a sudden you have control over those things separately. And then you see interesting patterns. And of course, that goes all the way back to the higher visual system, where you're putting it all together into objects, like even elephants and houses. And so you might start seeing things that completely aren't there because you're putting things together in a different way, right? But it's not just being driven by pure sensation, of course. It's also being driven because everything in the brain is a loop. Everything is connected in a recurrent way. It's also being driven by yourself. It's being driven by your memories and by things that you're thinking about or emotions that you have. So things that are really deeply associated with yourself and your previous experience are going to come up. And so you will hallucinate, but your hallucinations will be very personal. And so they can also be meaningful because they do have a sort of a relationship to yourself and to your experiences. And it also makes the distinction between, some people who try something like ayahuasca because they want to explore and work on themselves and get over PTSD or get over something, have a really good time with it. And they manage to use that opportunity. And others find it very scary because they encounter situations where they're seeing things, hearing things, or going through something that they don't feel they have control over, and it's not pleasant for them anymore. And it's interesting, it always seems to tie back into how you get into that situation. So what you're bringing with you as you start that session, because you're wrapping your own emotions and your own thoughts and your own experiences into it, right? So it's very interesting from that point of view. As a neuroscientist, though, going into the experience, it was a little weird because everybody else there was basically a new age hippie who was very much into, oh, this is deep and magical, and we're going somewhere with this. And meanwhile, I was likewise there hoping to get something useful out of it, just like in meditation, right? Where you want to work on yourself. But I wasn't thinking that it was weird and magical, not magical in any other way than the way the universe is completely magical. But so when everyone else is wondering what, they're just kind of seeing this as the magic of the plant, the ayahuasca plant. Sorry, it's actually two plants that are being used in there, coming together to give you this experience that it's the goddess of that plant that's doing that. And to me, it's like, oh, I'm seeing these things. Those neurons are desynchronized. So I'm just having the experience rather differently. I still got a lot out of it, but it was weird to be the only neuroscientist there. Maybe if I had a whole group of neuroscientists there, it would have been a whole other experience.
Really, really cool. So you said, these experiences could be meaningful but for me, maybe like the dreaming or these hallucinatory experiences, for me, it's been so real. I could swear that that was extremely real. For example, when you dream, like you have these dreams, nightfall, where you are with a girl, your girlfriend, and you're going for it, and you ejaculate. That's a nightfall. You feel that was real. And even these, when you have a substance, you feel that those things are real. Now, I am vested in virtual reality. I've been building virtual reality content since 2016. 2016. And that's the reason I'm so excited about that. Would there be certain part of brains eventually where we could kind of stimulate and recreate stories, or insert
Absolutely. Yeah. There's really nothing that you cannot do by stimulating the brain directly that you can only do by using a drug. Rather, the stimulation is always more precise. So where the drug is just something you take and it automatically affects your entire brain and even your entire body, and you don't have much control over where it goes. If you're doing a direct stimulation, then you have the opportunity to tweak exactly what you want. Just this center, just these neurons. Let's say you're too anxious, you want to reduce that anxiety for a while. Or you want to focus, or you want to be more awake, or you want to go to sleep, or you want to hallucinate. You could do all those things by directly stimulating, and you can already try these out with the transcranial electric current and that sort of process. You can even give someone an out-of-body experience by attaching a magnet in the right place.
Right.
And this gets back to actually your question about dreaming and how real it is, because this is something I forgot to mention. When you asked me about dreams, I forgot to get into that whole topic. The movie Inception is kind of interesting in the sense that it sort of makes you wonder how you can distinguish between reality and a dream. And I guess you have to first ask yourself what every philosopher has already done, which is this the real world? And what do I know about where we are, right? And then you get back to cogito ergo sum. All I know is that, it's just that because I think, therefore I am. It's the only thing you really know. And that's true because, what else do we know about the universe besides what we're perceiving and what we think about it and what we imagine? There's so many things connected here because partly our sensory input isn't everything that exists. First of all, we don't see X-rays. Also, we cannot perceive things that happen faster than a certain time, right? We have only about 1/10 of a second reaction time, so we can't really perceive much faster things. And we're also not great at integrating very slow things. When things happen over a very long period of time, we also really don't perceive it as if it's happening. And on the other hand, our memory is not really memory. It's not like a photograph or like an audio file. Instead, we learn patterns that we have encountered a lot when we were children. And those patterns become fixed. And then every time when we see things in the world, then we process again through those patterns. So it's not surprising that, for instance, the younger generation sees things a little different than the older generation because they've got different patterns that they established and that they see everything through. And so whatever we're processing from the outside goes through those patterns, and our memories do too. Our memories are not really pictures. They are reconstructions. We store something that is similar to those main patterns that we've established. And so we kind of remember, okay, what was Tuesday like? Well, this is what I experienced. I had that. And when I think I had a meeting with someone over coffee, and then I went and drove somewhere, I'm not remembering the exact details of that coffee and of that drive. I'm reconstructing what it could have plausibly been like. We make like a story. And in that sense, it's very similar actually to dreaming, right? We're just making this up as we go. So our memories are already just like our dreams. And the way we experience the world is just like our dreams, because again, it's not a complete picture of the world. It's just what we happen to be able to process and what we can correlate with things we understand and remember. So we're always building the world around us in our head.
Right.
And ourselves too in it. Like we put ourselves, our self-model, where we look at ourselves and think, oh, this is Randal and I'm here and I'm in this place. We put ourselves into that world model that we're building in our head. So in that sense, how is that any different than a dream?
Right, exactly. Yeah. So when I've been invested in virtual reality, and with the virtual reality, you could create digital worlds which could be indistinguishable from physical worlds. So I'm super excited about that. Now coming back to the topic of the brain, we have somewhere around 86 billion neurons and some 100 trillion synapses. And right now we know extremely little about the brain. But then eventually, I guess, because technology is growing exponentially, we will kind of find ways to figure out to kind of map all the cognitive structure and then eventually create an emulation. So all that seems plausible. 50 years, 100 years, that seems like a possibility, because there are some great minds such as yourself, and there's Neuralink, there's Kernel, there's Control Lab, so many people who are working on the space. But we don't know anything about this thing called consciousness. Understanding brain and uploading that, yes, that's possible. What about consciousness? What is it? Where does it reside? How do we manage to capture that and kind of map it? How do you think that would be a possibility?
Yeah. First of all, I agree with your assessment about what is plausible or possible, in the sense that unlike, say, for example, traveling faster than light, there's nothing physically just baffling about the possibility of building an artificial brain if you can build biological brains. It's really a matter of understanding how. Consciousness is the number one topic people ask about when the topic of mind uploading or anything related to that comes up, obviously. And it's funny because consciousness is such a vague word. It is so, everybody means something else. And most of the time when they're asking about it, they don't even know which version of consciousness they're actually asking about at that point in time. This is a bit of a problem, because you talk to a clinician and you talk about consciousness, then they are talking about how does the patient respond? Can the patient respond to anything? Is he conscious? Or is she conscious? And then, recently they discovered that with fMRI, they could find out that many of the patients they thought were in a complete vegetative coma were actually conscious. They were aware, they could hear. They just couldn't respond at all. They were locked in a locked-in state. And that meant they had to be treated quite differently. So still some interesting discoveries on the clinical side, but that's not really the consciousness that people ask about when they ask these questions. They ask about something else. They ask about the self-perception. They ask about the subjective perspective, really. What is it like to be yourself as opposed to someone else? How does that distinguish you from that other person? Or what is it like? Why is it this way to be a conscious human as opposed to, say, a conscious dog or a conscious cat or a conscious bat or whatever? And this is... so that's when you start to get into the actual question people care about, but it would be nice if they could still clarify in a little bit more detail exactly which part they're worried about or that they want to understand. Because even there, you can go in many directions. So you see, for example, theories like integrated information theory that is currently popular because it's being popularized by Tononi and Koch, both very, very good neuroscientists whom I appreciate a lot. But their theory isn't very useful for most of the things that we care about when we talk about consciousness, because they kind of calculate a number that they call psi over a device or a brain, looking at how many connections it has. And then they can say, well, this has a high psi, so that can be this conscious. But that sounds more like a sort of proto-conscious resources requirement number. Something that says, okay, you need a device of at least this kind to be able to make something that can have consciousness, even if it's true. And the connection hasn't really been made between those things. But even if that's true, that number doesn't say very much. Whereas the kinds of consciousness theories that are more useful to better understand why it feels the way we feel are the ones that really try to look at functionally the experience that goes on when you're conscious versus when you're not, or how, the parts of that, what makes up that experience. And that's when you get into questions around attention. This attention in neuroscience is a topic about how different parts of the brain can be active as the focal point of what the brain is currently integrating and putting together. And there are some theories like attention schema theory by Michael Graziano that are actually very useful in that sense, because they at least try to make testable hypotheses that really talk about those parts of our experience. But even those theories, because in attention schema theory, it's still being done from an objective observer point of view, looking at, okay, to get the experience of a human, we need access to working memory, we need access to memory. And when we are having a conversation with someone, their voice has to be able to pull us into paying attention to the audio that we're receiving in our auditory system and turn it into words and then make responses. But that is still a third-person point of view, right? It doesn't tell you about the sensation of your personal identity, about the why am I here and not there? What happens when I become unconscious and then I wake up the next day or after a surgery or something like that? How come that's still me? Where did my consciousness go in between and how did it get here? That sort of thing, right? Which the problem with most of those questions is that they are often untestable, which makes them very, very hard to deal with in science, because science always wants to make statements that can be somehow refuted. When it gets into the area where you don't have tests, then you get in the danger zone where it becomes more about beliefs, things that you care about. Like, I think that for me, it is important that my consciousness always resides in the same place. If I'm here and then I'm suddenly there, then I don't believe that I transfer or something like that. Or it is important for me that my consciousness is unbroken. There has to be a stream of consciousness, which, by the way, is something that none of us experience. None of us have a stream of consciousness. That you can watch some really wonderful work by Susan Blackmore about that. Stream of consciousness is a fantasy. It's an illusion, as in there is certainly consciousness, but it's not the way that you imagine it is. And the stream of consciousness is definitely not unbroken. In fact, it's more like it's post hoc, where you sometimes do things that seem that you're doing in a conscious fashion, as in you are attending to something. And then if you pay attention to what your experience was like a moment ago, so in the past, and you say, oh, was I doing this consciously? Then you realize, yes, I was, or no, I wasn't. And you can point to those. So you can make statements about the past of that. This is a very long topic. We have a lot of videos actually about this on the Carboncopies YouTube channel, right? Because it's such an intriguing and ongoing thing. It takes hours to talk people through it. And what you end up talking through is that there are some things we can currently really latch onto in science and say, this we can talk about because there's something testable here. And there are other things where it becomes a matter of people making statements that are about their personal belief about what should happen or should be the case or correct, but it's untestable. And so then you have multiple beliefs you can line up, and there's no way of really deciding between them. And so that's as far as we've gotten.
Right.
But yeah, we can dive into a particular part of that if you want to. But it's really, the thing with consciousness is people make hand-wavy statements and big questions, but then you have to guide them into a very long, complicated conversation to talk about the detail they actually care about. Yeah.
Completely understand. Yeah. So I had the good fortune of having a conversation with Michael Graziano, and he explained to me about the attention schema theory. But yeah, so if there's no common consensus, when it comes to consciousness. I guess that's where the problem is. Now, would you like to explain to my audience what substrate-independent mind is, your work at Carboncopies, and the whole brain emulation? Where does your research work stand at this point in time?
Actually, I'll start with the term mind uploading because it's just very common. That term is a science fiction term. It's this notion of, you're here, you plug yourself in, boom, you're over there. And it's kind of similar to teleportation in that way. But of course, it's just a wish. It's an objective. It's kind of, wouldn't it be cool if you could do that? We use the word whole brain emulation to describe how we think that in a more technical and engineering fashion, something like that would be possible. So you're really talking about building an artificial brain. And in order to make that artificial brain be the brain that generates your mind, that generates your feelings and memories, you have to record a lot of details about the brain, and then you need to emulate how those details are being used in your brain. So you need to make something, like when we talk about an emulator in computers, we talk about emulating Nintendo on a PC or emulating a Mac on a PC or something like that. and then you want the programs to run the same as they would on the original machine. It's the same idea with an emulator of the brain. You have a biological brain that processes things. Now, if we don't want to use biology, we need something that works similarly, that produces the same results that we care about. We don't really care about the fact that it's using bits and bytes in there, because I don't know, for instance, where my synapses are that are currently firing. That's not important to me. So I don't care if it has synapses, but I care about the experience being the same, basically. So that's what whole brain emulation is about. And substrate-independent mind was a term that I started using for a while to try to describe the idea that once you have these emulators, that then you can move processing of the brain to many different kinds of platforms or substrates. So it's actually similar to platform-independent code, substrate-independent mind. It should not be thought of as zero substrate mind. So it's not ghosts or holograms or something that have no material behind them. Of course, something has to be processing the data that's there. Yeah.
Right. So
Carboncopies. Yeah, just to and land on that. Carboncopies is a nonprofit organization that we founded a while ago as a hub for the community of people who care about this technology and this idea, and also the sociological impacts, and also the philosophy. Of course, lots of philosophy about consciousness and things like that. And we have 85 people on the team right now. That's just the team that actually works on projects. It's not counting the community of people who, read our Facebook page and our newsletter and that sort of thing. They are distributed. So we have about, I'd say 30% of them are somewhere in the US, and then another 20% in Europe, and then some in Australia, some in Russia. There are a few from India, and unfortunately, so far, none from Africa or South America, which is kind of sad. Hopefully that will come. And about 40% of them are women. So it's not a perfect balance, but it's better than you might think it would be. And what we do is we do outreach. We do try to explain. We try to provide educational materials, and to follow the sort of have this live roadmap that we keep on updating on what's going on in the field. And then we have events where we connect with scientific experts and involve ourselves in research projects. So we've got 3 research projects going on right now, one of which is with a group that's affiliated with the Human Brain Project out of Italy. There's another one that has been collaborating with a team at MIT. And then finally, there's the Roadmap Updating Project, which is an internal one. But yeah, those are our research ones.
Right. So when you say you want to emulate the whole brain, where does the current technology stand at this point in time? What are the technology or the tool available for mapping, as in reading the data and writing the same out?
Yeah. So there are 2 different categories of brain mapping. One is structural mapping. That's when you want to discover the connectome, all the connections between different neurons, and maybe more details than that, like the proteins that are being used, what type of neuron, and so forth. And the other is functional. So you've got structural and functional. Functional is recording the activity of a brain and learning from that. Now, in the field of structural mapping, actually the progress is quite good and quite rapid. Over the last 10 to 12 years, 12 years ago, this term connectome really first emerged. And since then, we've gotten to the point where now there is a map of the Drosophila fruit fly brain. There's a map of the C-Elegans worm. There is a complete high-resolution scan at electron microscopy level of 1 cubic millimeter of mouse brain, which is actually tremendously huge. It's very hard to imagine that a cubic millimeter could be a lot, but because the electron microscope resolution is about 3.5 nanometers, this actually took 6 electron microscopes, 5 months of 24/7 scanning to achieve at the Allen Brain Institute. And it's ramping up. So the same thing that took 5 months then would probably take only 1 or 2 months right now, and it's going to increase that way. So eventually, within a short span of time, we'll have the complete map at that level of detail for the mouse brain. And you can see how that will then increase to other brain sizes. That's the structural side, which I'm confident is going in the right direction. The functional side is more difficult at the moment. So recording activity in brains, it works very well in two cases. It works very well when you have either a very small animal that has a mostly transparent brain, like say zebrafish larvae, or even various insects like the Drosophila fruit fly, where you can also do similar experiments. You can either take away a piece of the skull or there is no skull, and then you can use calcium imaging to see all of the neurons acting at the same time and record when they fire and when they don't. The other case where it also works is if you can make genetically modified versions of the animal, like genetically modified strands of mice, where every time when the neuron fires, it causes the neuron to glow. And so then you can look at that with something that can with a microscope that can pick up those changes in light. And that way you can also see what's going on in the brain, and you can stimulate as well with light as well using optogenetics. Those, when you can apply those techniques, then you can get quite far in recording activity in the brain. When you can't, when it's more difficult because, say, for example, if you're dealing with a human, then first of all, you don't really like taking away the skull and just opening it up so that you can put a microscope there and watch things. Also, we don't yet have permission to transgenically change what the neurons are doing to make them emit light. That's something that we can't do yet because it just hasn't been tested to the point where we know it's safe. So all of those techniques are still kind of out of bounds with humans, which means, unfortunately, that the only ways to get the information is either in an external manner, like with an fMRI that doesn't get a lot of resolution, or by inserting electrodes, like what Neuralink is working on, where, sure, we can put a lot of electrodes in now. It's thousands that you can put in, and a lot of recording sites in there. But still, that's a tiny, tiny fraction when you think about the number of neurons in the brain. So that's still a bit of a problem. And I'm closely watching to see what might turn out to be the most effective route forward there, because we really do need large-scale functional recording from many areas in the brain, even if we can get most of the detail of what's in the brain from the structural scans, because you need to correlate those two. You need to be able to take the structure, and when you look at a neuron and you see, oh, this looks like this kind of neuron. There's, say, for example, a pyramidal neuron. It's a type of neuron that's common in say, the cortex, for instance. If we see that, we know, first of all, that it's an excitatory neuron. It's a neuron that will make other neurons fire. That's good. But we also want to know more. We want to know the response time of that neuron, like how fast does it respond and what does its response look like? And if we have enough of these recordings, then perhaps we can correlate the shape of that neuron and the thickness of its dendrites and all those details with basically a library of what those responses are supposed to be. But before we have that information, we don't have enough to turn this structural scan back into a working model, something that will actually produce a working brain. That's why we haven't seen that yet from basically anything except tiny pieces of the brain. Retina. We've done neuroprosthetic replacements for pieces of the retina, which is really the exterior-most part of the brain. We've also done some work there on the hippocampus. The USC team has done great work on building a hippocampal prosthetic model, which was also created by recording in the hippocampus and then making a model that produces the same kind of output. So yeah, we need a lot more of that kind of recording. And there's still a big challenge there. There's something there where I think someone with a brilliant insight could make a huge breakthrough, could make a huge impact and change the field overnight if they're very good at it. Otherwise, it's going to be a very, very long slog to record all those different types of neurons in all those different parts of the brain and to become so well versed in that, to understand it so well that we can make those correlations with confidence in the structural scans that we can produce.
spoke about the nematode C-Elegan worm. I think this was done early 2000, right? The entire Connectome project, where the C-Elegan has somewhere around 302 neurons. Putting them on a Connectome. What has been the progress from the first time when you actually uploaded the entire cognitive structure of a C-Elegan onto a Connectome? Because it's been over a decade since you did that. And at this point in time, do you think there is, you could be leveraging artificial intelligence, machine learning to kind of like figure out, the scanning process better? Do you see that happening? Is somebody looking at something like that?
Yeah, I'm sure that's possible. I myself am actually not very involved with C-Elegan's work. I'm also not really enormously interested in it, although it's still interesting. And the reason for that is because C-Elegan's brains are so unusually different from, say, Drosophila fruit fly brains or mouse brains or the hippocampus, if we look at the hippocampal neuroprostheses or retina. Because in C-Elegans, where you have, in the female, I think it's 302 neurons, or was that the male? I keep forgetting. They only have a male hermaphrodite and a female version.
Right.
The neurons are all different because it's almost like every single neuron represents a brain area. They're extraordinarily different. Each individual one has a certain function. So instead of having an entire region with, say, a whole similar kind of neuron that is like a pool of resources, like the way that in a computer you would have a pool of RAM or something like that, we have that in our cortex, and even the fruit fly has that. But C-Elegans does not. C-Elegans doesn't do that. On top of that, all of our neurons, and the ones in the fruit fly and in the mouse and everywhere else, they fire with these spikes, these action potentials. That's how they communicate. It's like, pang, I'm on. And it's really the timing of those action potentials that's essential. But the C-Elegans worm doesn't do that either. It uses subthreshold communication. So the neurons don't fire. It's like an electric circuit where the sort of analog change in the current is something that needs to be processed from neuron to neuron. So that's an entirely different type of model. And so forth. There are lots of differences here. That's why it's interesting, but it's not a very good model of the types of brains that we most care about. And hence, most of us have sort of moved away from that and aren't paying a lot of attention to that. That has a lot to do with why the progress in the C-Elegans isn't that fast. The other reason why, even in that decade, there hasn't been, say, you're not seeing consumer models of buy a worm. You can have your own C-Elegans worm. It'll crawl across your table, your little robot. We don't have that because even though the map is there of the connectome, there was not actually yet a full characterization of each of these neurons. So the full response characterization isn't really there. The characterization of all of the neurotransmitters being used and how they respond. So what kind of a electric current response they produce. That is partial because there has been some work looking at these worms with calcium imaging and pulling out some of the information there, but there's still work to be done on it. The Open Worm project, led by Stephen Larson, whom I consider a friend, and he's actually going to be on a Carboncopies workshop in a few weeks. He's been working on that model, but I think he's also started to look at other things a bit. Open Worm spent a lot of time coming up with ways of making models for how the worm should move based on the muscular setup in the worm. And that seems to work pretty well. That's kind of an application of that AI principle that you were talking about using something to train it up to then behave the way it's supposed to work. But it's not the same thing as having a map of its brain and then having that map control the worm. So yeah, that's still not there. And there are those unique reasons why. So when I look at the progress in being able to emulate brain function, I tend to look more at things like the hippocampal neuroprosthetic, which is directly involved inside the core of the brain, in the part where episodic memories are created, and is really relevant and essential to us, and uses spikes and populations of neurons to encode things and all that sort of thing. So that's the progress that I tend to follow more.
Right. So what's been the learning from the 1 cubic meter of the mouse brain which was scanned and captured? What's been the learnings from there?
Millimeter, to be clear.
So very cubic. So yeah, it is cubic. Yeah. So the 1 cubic millimeter of the scan. What's been the learning, and what comes next after that?
So I'm not sure what the learning is yet, because it was only just published. So it came out in Nature just weeks ago. I'm not sure that anyone's had a chance to really dive in and learn a heck of a lot from that yet. So ask me again in a few years, maybe.
Right. Yeah. So what are the timelines that you give yourself for possibly getting to maybe animals, a complete animal, and then eventually going on to a human? What's the timelines that you have in your mind of doing like a complete whole brain evolution?
So I think that if we had if there was interest in doing an emulation of the entire fruit fly, then I think that that's something that could be done in a time span of 5 to 10 years, given what we've already done in terms of collecting data, and then the time needed to analyze the data and the time to translate that into models that work. If we're talking about the mouse brain, that's a longer process, and it gets to the point where you have to worry about other stuff, like how much funding is going into that field and all of that thing, because it's too far away for one project to just get there. So then, we have to start applying these uncertainties and say things like, okay, I would be surprised if we saw this in less than 15 years, and I would be equally surprised if humanity continues to make progress in neuroscience as we have so far and in computing, and we don't see it in 60 years or something like that. These are the numbers I would give it. So, but then there's a range, right? And then for human brains, then you probably double that or something. So I'd be surprised if we saw it before 30 years. That would be like, I'd be wondering what kind of magical technique someone came up with to do that so fast. And then, or maybe it's fake. and then, I'd be surprised if we didn't get it done in 100 or 120 years, because if you look back at 100 years and see where we were to now and compare that with the progress forward and think in terms of how things have accelerated so far, it would be surprising if we didn't manage that, assuming things like our economy remains intact, our science continues going, and we're not all at war with each other or something like that. So there are some, caveats around that are not even specific to science. They're more just humanity.
Right. Thank you, Randal. It was a pleasure and honor talking to you. I know you'll be running short on time, but yeah, we are living in exciting time. Technology is growing on exponential space, and somehow I feel in the next couple of years, with the growth of artificial intelligence, that's going to be playing a huge role in, helping us with researching these big questions. Because I guess that the biggest thing for us is like the outward world, the space, and the inside world of brain, and both are so little we know of it.
And they're connected, aren't they?
Yeah, they are completely.
It's extraordinarily difficult for people to travel into space because our bodies are not very good at dealing with radiation. They're not very good at dealing with no oxygen. Right. And that sort of thing. So wouldn't it be wonderful if you could just switch into another body that was great for space travel when you want to go? And you can last long enough to make that trip. That would be good too. So these two are connected. I also quickly, just sort of like an encore to the question about the timeline, I just want to mention that, it's important to take some perspective, to step back and to look at what it really means to say, okay, we're between 30 and 120 years away from some kind of massive change in how things are, because suddenly we have emulated brains possible. That is not a long time, because on a sort of human timescale of how things happen, when you look at how long it took for the Industrial Revolution or space flight and air flight and cars and whatever, if you look at all those things, you could say, okay, if it's this close, if we can actually predict the sort of steps we have to make, and it's between 30 and 120, that means we're on the cusp of this. And anyone who's working on this right now is making a significant contribution to it actually happening. Everyone who's mapping the brain now is making a significant contribution to it. This is not far future stuff. It's really soon. for humanity as a whole. So just like with AI, it's something that we therefore need to think about and keep in our minds as a part of where we're going.
Right. Yeah. So I'm super excited. And I think the first time in human history, we are breaking away from silos and now working together. There's open BCI platform, and there are some people all around the world. I think internet has democratized knowledge and education, and I guess it's given the desire and intent to go out for these bold things. I mean, I really wish that we go out into space, understand our brain, and even the physics of our universe. I mean, there are people who are working on string theory who are being ridiculed, but I wish that people understand that it's too deep, it's way beyond. And sometimes, I feel the entire universe is a fractal. The more you kind of like dig deeper, you kind of like come to the same place, and then you realize, oh wow, you're at the starting point. So I'm super excited. Yes, you spoke about digital immortality. If we manage to do mind uploading. So yes, we're in a fantastic space. There's Neuralink who's working on it. There's kernel, there's control labs, and we are just scratching the surface. But I guess all of these technologies is in a nascent stage, and I guess in another few decades it just could be magical, because I guess we're gonna reach out and leverage the power of machines, and somehow I feel or human biology and machines are not much different, because our brains run because of electrics which are firing, or cells runs because of these trillions of cells because of electricity. So somehow I feel that we are also somewhere mechanical in nature. So I wish you the very best for whatever you're doing, and I hope that it comes much sooner than later, because the transformation, what could happen once we are able to kind of understand our brain, how it wires and fires, and maybe eventually be able to upload it on a digital substrate, that would be, I think, transformational for mankind. I'm super excited for it. Keep doing what you're doing, and we need more people like that. And to my listeners, if you like what you see in here, please press the subscribe button. Until next time, see you guys. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.